"Marry my son and get 1M," a billionaire told the janitor. But her shocking counteroffer left the entire family speechless. What starts as a cruel deal twists into a battle of pride, dignity, and love as hidden truths about family, betrayal, and redemption explode into the open. When a little boy whispers a secret that could change everything, lives are shattered and hearts are tested. Will this unlikely woman's courage heal generations, or will money and lies destroy them forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Kingston Manor, its golden rays highlighting specks of dust dancing in the air. Ruth Dawson moved her mop across the marble floor in smooth, practiced strokes, the familiar motion as natural to her as breathing after 15 years of service in the mansion. The polished marble reflected her weathered face as she worked, each stroke revealing a clearer mirror of the world above. Her gray hair was neatly tucked beneath a simple cotton bandana, and her uniform, though worn, was spotlessly clean. The quiet of the morning was her favorite time, before the hustle of the day began, when she could work in peace and lift her silent prayers heavenward. But today, that peace was shattered by raised voices from Harold Kingston's study. Ruth tried not to listen, but the words carried clearly through the heavy wooden door. "For heaven's sake, Daniel, you're 32 years old. When are you going to do something worthwhile with your life?" Harold's voice crackled with frustration. "Define worthwhile, Father." Daniel's tone dripped with sarcasm. "Another business venture you can criticize? Another investment you can call foolish?" Ruth's mop slowed as she heard the pain beneath Daniel's defiance. She'd watched him grow from a bright-eyed teenager into this bitter young man, and sometimes she caught glimpses of the hurt little boy still hiding behind his expensive suits and carefully crafted indifference. "Worthwhile?" Harold's voice rose. "How about anything that doesn't involve spending my money on parties and failed projects? Your sister's managing 3 companies, and you can't even keep a job for 3 months." Ruth heard something crash, probably another one of Mrs. Kingston's crystal paperweights. She winced, knowing she'd be cleaning up the pieces later. "Maybe I don't want to be another corporate puppet," Daniel shouted back. "Maybe I want—" "What you want." Harold's laugh was harsh. "What you want has cost me millions. You know what your problem is? You've never had to work for anything. Never had to struggle like." He paused, and Ruth could feel his attention shift toward the door. "Like Mrs. Dawson out there, cleaning our floors." Ruth's hands tightened on her mop handle. She should move away, give them privacy, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "Leave Ruth out of this," Daniel muttered, surprising her with his defense. "She's got nothing to do with—" "She has everything to do with it." Harold's voice took on a dangerous edge. "You want to know the difference between you and her? She works, she takes responsibility. He broke off, and Ruth could almost hear the idea forming in his mind. "You know what? You want to secure your future? Marry her." The silence that followed was deafening. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. "What?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Marry Mrs. Dawson," Harold said, warming to his bizarre idea. "I'll pay you both $1 million. Cash. Maybe living with someone who actually understands the value of work will teach you something." Daniel's laughter echoed through the study. "You finally lost it, Father, completely lost it." "Have I?" The study door flew open, and Harold Kingston stood there in his expensive suit, his face flushed with anger. His eyes locked onto Ruth, who had straightened up, still holding her mop. "Mrs. Dawson, perfect timing. How would you like to marry my son for $1 million?" Ruth felt her face grow hot, but years of dignity kept her spine straight. Daniel appeared behind his father, his handsome face twisted in embarrassment and anger. "Father, stop this nonsense. I'm serious," Harold interrupted, pulling out his phone. "I'll have the papers drawn up today. $1 million to marry my worthless son and maybe teach him something about life in the process." He looked at Ruth with a mixture of challenge and condescension. "Well, what do you say to that, Mrs. Dawson?" Ruth looked at the 2 men before her. Harold, powerful and imposing in his tailored suit, his gray hair perfectly styled. Daniel, younger but somehow more worn, his expensive clothes wrinkled from a night of partying, his eyes avoiding hers. She thought of her late husband, John, who had died in Vietnam with nothing but honor to his name. She thought of her modest apartment, her volunteer work at the community center, her simple but dignified life. Then she thought of the disrespect in Harold Kingston's voice, the assumption that everyone and everything could be bought for the right price. Slowly, Ruth set her mop against the wall. She straightened her uniform and looked Harold Kingston directly in the eye. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "Mr. Kingston, I clean your floors because it's honest work, and I take pride in doing it well. But I won't marry anyone for money." Ruth Dawson straightened her back, her weathered hands still gripping the wooden handle of her mop. The tension in Harold Kingston's study grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Both father and son stared at her, clearly expecting the elderly janitor to scurry away in shame. "With all due respect, Mr. Kingston," Ruth said, her voice gentle but firm, "I won't be accepting your money." Her calm words seemed to echo in the book-lined study. Harold's eyebrows shot up, and he let out a short, harsh laugh. "Well, that's a first. Someone turning down $1 million. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with newfound curiosity. Daniel Kingston slouched against the mahogany desk, his expensive suit wrinkled from his careless posture. "See, Father? Even the help knows this whole thing is ridiculous." He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, messing it up slightly. Ruth set her mop aside, folding her hands in front of her worn uniform. "I didn't say I wouldn't consider marriage." She paused, watching both men's expressions shift from dismissive to confused. "I have a counter-offer." "A counter-offer?" Harold's voice dripped with amusement. "From the janitor?" He gestured for her to continue, clearly entertained by what he considered an absurd situation. "Yes, sir." Ruth's eyes met Daniel's directly. "I'll marry your son, but only if he works alongside me as a janitor for 1 year. The smirk fell from Daniel's face. "What?" "You heard me correctly." Ruth's voice remained steady. 1 full year of honest work, cleaning floors, scrubbing toilets, and doing everything I do. No shortcuts, no special treatment. Harold's laughter filled the room. "Oh, this is rich! The janitor wants to teach my son about honest work." He wiped at his eyes, but Ruth noticed the calculating look that had replaced his initial disdain. "I'm not joking, Mr. Kingston," Ruth continued. "Your son needs to prove he has a soul worth living with. Money can't buy that kind of worth." Daniel pushed himself away from the desk, his face flushed with anger. "This is insane! Father, you can't seriously be considering this nonsense." Harold held up his hand, silencing his son. "Actually, Daniel, I find myself intrigued." He stood up, walking around his massive desk to face Ruth directly. "You have quite the nerve, Mrs. Dawson. Most people would have grabbed the money and run." "I'm not most people, sir." Ruth met his gaze without flinching. "And money isn't everything, isn't it?" Harold's eyes narrowed. "What exactly would this arrangement entail?" "Daniel works my full shift every day. He learns what it means to serve others instead of being served. No special treatment, no cutting corners." Ruth's voice grew stronger with each word. "He'll work at the community center where I volunteer too. He'll learn what it means to make a real difference in people's lives." "This is ridiculous," Daniel exploded. "I'm not going to become a janitor. I'm a Kingston. And what exactly has being a Kingston meant to you so far, son?" Harold's sharp question cut through Daniel's protest. "Besides spending my money and embarrassing the family name?" Daniel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. 1 year, Ruth repeated softly. "That's all I'm asking. If Daniel can prove he's more than just a wealthy man's son, if he can show he understands the value of hard work and treating others with dignity, then yes, I'll marry him." Harold drummed his fingers on his desk, studying Ruth with new respect. "You know what? I accept your terms." "Father!" Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. "You start tomorrow, Daniel." Harold's tone left no room for argument. 6 a.m. sharp. Mrs. Dawson will show you the ropes." He turned to Ruth. "And if he fails, then you'll know your money couldn't buy him character," Ruth replied simply. Daniel's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He stormed toward the door, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor Ruth had just cleaned. "This is absolutely insane. I won't do it." "You will," Harold commanded, "or you'll be cut off completely. No more allowance, no more trust fund, no more safety net. Your choice, son." Daniel yanked the door open with such force that it banged against the wall. Without another word, he stormed out, slamming it behind him with enough force to rattle the window panes. Harold turned back to Ruth, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Mrs. Dawson, you've certainly made this morning interesting." He walked back to his chair, settling into it with an air of satisfaction. "I look forward to seeing how this plays out." Ruth picked up her mop, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. As she turned to leave, she closed her eyes briefly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. "Lord," she whispered, barely audible, "guide me on this path you've set before me." The morning sun streamed through the mansion's tall windows as Daniel Kingston sauntered into the main hall. His designer jeans and cashmere sweater looked more suited for a casual brunch than a day of cleaning. He checked his expensive watch. 7:58 a.m. At least he wasn't late. Ruth Dawson stood waiting by her cleaning cart, already dressed in her gray uniform. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her sensible shoes showed years of wear. Without a word, she handed Daniel a plastic bucket and a mop. "You can't be serious," Daniel said, holding the bucket like it might bite him. "These are $300 jeans." "Then tomorrow you'll know better," Ruth replied evenly. She gestured to the utility closet. "Fill the bucket with warm water. There's cleaning solution on the second shelf." Daniel wrinkled his nose as he measured out the cleaning solution. "It smells like a hospital in here." "That's the smell of clean," Ruth said. She demonstrated the proper way to wring out the mop. "Not too wet. You don't want puddles, long, even strokes." For the first hour, Daniel made a show of dragging the mop across the floor, barely touching the surface. His phone kept buzzing with messages, and his eyes darted to it constantly. "The floor won't clean itself while you check your phone," Ruth said, steadily working her way across the room. "I have important business to attend to," Daniel muttered. "This is your business now," Ruth reminded him. She pointed to a spot he'd missed. "You'll need to do that section again." By mid-morning, Daniel had disappeared for the third time, claiming he needed a bathroom break. Ruth found him in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone while sipping an espresso. "Breaks are 15 minutes, same as everyone else," she said firmly. "And that was 20 minutes ago." Daniel's face flushed. "You can't tell me when to take breaks. My father owns this place." "Your father agreed to these terms," Ruth replied. "If you want to quit, that's your choice." Something in her calm demeanor made Daniel stand up, though he made sure to take his time finishing his coffee. Back in the hall, Ruth showed him how to properly scrub a stubborn scuff mark. "You have to put your back into it," she explained, demonstrating the circular motion. "See? Now you try." Daniel knelt down, grimacing as his knees touched the floor. His first attempts were half-hearted, barely making a dent in the mark. "I've never had to clean anything in my life," he admitted, frustration creeping into his voice. "Everyone starts somewhere," Ruth said. She knelt beside him, her movements efficient and practiced. "Watch again. Like this." The hours crawled by. Daniel's perfectly styled hair grew damp with sweat, and his designer clothes were splattered with cleaning solution. His hands, unused to physical labor, developed red marks where he gripped the mop handle. During lunch, Ruth sat quietly in the staff break room, unpacking a simple sandwich and an apple from her worn plastic lunchbox. Daniel had ordered in sushi, the expensive containers looking out of place on the scratched break room table. "You could at least try to make conversation," Daniel said, breaking the awkward silence. Ruth looked up from her sandwich. "I believe actions speak louder than words, Mr. Kingston." The afternoon stretched endlessly. Daniel's movements grew slower, his complaints more frequent. Every muscle in his body ached. He watched in disbelief as Ruth maintained the same steady pace she'd started with, methodically working her way through their assigned areas. "How do you do this every day?" he asked, leaning against his mop. "The same way anyone does their job," Ruth replied, "1 hour at a time." By the end of the shift, Daniel collapsed into a chair in the staff room, his designer clothes wrinkled and stained. His phone had been silent for hours. Apparently, his friends had given up trying to reach him. Ruth gathered her things with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all day. She picked up her old lunchbox, its scratched surface telling stories of countless workdays. Without a word, she walked out, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and aching muscles. The screen door creaked as Ruth stepped onto the worn wooden porch of her modest two-bedroom home. The sweet scent of cornbread wafted through the evening air, making her smile despite her aching muscles. She paused to wipe her feet on the welcome mat, its faded letters still readable after all these years. "Blessed be this home." Inside, 7-year-old Tommy sat at the kitchen table, his legs swinging back and forth as he concentrated on his homework. His mother Angela stood at the stove, stirring a pot of pinto beans that had been simmering all day. "Grandma!" Tommy jumped up from his chair, nearly knocking it over in his excitement. His small arms wrapped around Ruth's waist, and she hugged him back, careful not to let her tired bones show in her embrace. Angela turned from the stove, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "Mama, you look exhausted. What did those Kingstons do to you today?" Ruth set her worn lunchbox on the counter and hung her jacket on the hook by the door. "Nothing I couldn't handle, baby. Just a long day of honest work." "Honest work?" Angela's tone sharpened. "Since when does Daniel Kingston know anything about honest work?" Tommy looked between his mother and grandmother, his pencil forgotten on his math worksheet. Ruth gestured for him to continue his homework while she helped Angela finish preparing dinner. The kitchen was small but tidy. With yellow curtains Ruth had sewn herself brightening the window above the sink. Family photos lined the walls, telling their story through the years. Ruth and her late husband, Angela's graduation, Tommy's first day of school. "The beans smell wonderful," Ruth said, trying to change the subject as she pulled 3 mismatched bowls from the cabinet. Angela wasn't letting go. "Mama, I know Harold Kingston. He's playing some kind of game with you. Why else would he suggest such a ridiculous arrangement?" Ruth placed the cornbread on the table, its golden brown crust still warm. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Angela. Sometimes he uses the most unlikely situations to teach important lessons." They sat down to eat, Tommy's eyes bright as Ruth blessed the food. The ceramic bowls clinked against the wooden table as Angela served them each a helping of beans. "Grandma," Tommy asked between bites of cornbread, "how come you're so tired today? More than usual?" Ruth smiled at her grandson's perceptive nature. "Well, sugar, I'm helping someone learn about real work today. The kind that makes your muscles ache, but your heart feel good." "Is it that man from the big house?" Tommy asked. "The one Mama says never worked a day in his life?" Angela shot Tommy a sharp look, but Ruth just chuckled. "Yes, that's the one. And everyone deserves a chance to learn, don't they?" "I guess so," Tommy said thoughtfully, dunking his cornbread in the bean juice. "Like when Miss Peterson helped me learn multiplication, even though I was really bad at first." "Exactly like that," Ruth nodded, reaching over to ruffle his hair. Angela pushed her bowl away, barely touched. "Mama, I don't like this. Harold Kingston is the kind of man who thinks people like us are beneath him. And Daniel." She glanced at Tommy and lowered her voice. "Well, we know what kind of person Daniel Island." Ruth reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I know you're worried, baby. But sometimes people can surprise us. And sometimes the good Lord puts us in someone's path for a reason." After dinner, Tommy helped clear the table while Angela washed the dishes, her movements sharp with worry. Ruth wiped down the counter, her movements slower than usual after the day's work. The evening routine continued as it always had. Tommy's homework check, a bit of TV time watching an old game show, and then bath time. Ruth sat in her comfortable armchair, reading her Bible while Angela folded laundry on the couch. When bedtime came, Ruth took her turn tucking Tommy in, as she did every night. His room was small but cozy, with model airplanes hanging from the ceiling and a bookshelf full of stories about heroes and adventures. "Grandma," Tommy whispered as she pulled his airplane-patterned comforter up to his chin. His voice was soft, almost dreamlike. Will he be my daddy someday? Ruth's hand froze on the blanket. Her heart seemed to skip a beat as she looked into her grandson's hopeful eyes. The innocent question hung in the air like a delicate soap bubble, beautiful but fragile. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, breathing in the clean scent of his freshly washed hair. With gentle hands, she tucked the blanket around him one more time, buying herself a moment to steady her voice. The glow of his airplane nightlight cast soft shadows on the wall as Ruth finally stood up straight, her joints protesting the movement. She looked down at Tommy, his eyes already heavy with sleep, and whispered, "Good night, sugar. Sweet dreams." She turned off his bedside lamp, leaving only the soft blue glow of the nightlight. As she stood in the doorway, watching his breathing even out, Ruth's heart was heavy with the weight of his question. The innocent hope in his voice had struck a chord deep within her, reminding her of just how much was at stake in this unusual arrangement with the Kingstons. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Kingston estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Ruth had already begun polishing. Her soft humming of Amazing Grace filled the empty hallway as she worked, her movements practiced and precise. Daniel Kingston stumbled in 30 minutes late, his designer jacket slung carelessly over his shoulder. Dark circles under his eyes suggested a late night, probably at one of his usual expensive clubs. He paused at the entrance, watching Ruth work with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "You're actually enjoying this, aren't you?" he said, shaking his head. "It's not even 7 in the morning." Ruth looked up from her work, her hands never stopping their steady motion. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Kingston. Your bucket and mop are waiting by the supply closet." Daniel rolled his eyes, but headed toward the cleaning supplies. "You know, most people would jump at $1 million. But no, you had to make this difficult." "Nothing worth having comes easy," Ruth replied, her voice calm and steady. She continued her methodical cleaning, moving backward in a careful pattern that left no streaks on the floor. Daniel grabbed the cleaning supplies with obvious distaste, nearly knocking over a bottle of solution in the process. "This stuff reeks," he complained, wrinkling his nose at the chemical smell. "Careful with that," Ruth warned. "It's concentrated. You only need—" Before she could finish, Daniel tilted the bottle too quickly, and a large splash of cleaning solution spilled across the floor, creating a puddle that began spreading rapidly. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Ruth exclaimed, quickly grabbing some rags from her cart. "That's enough to clean half the house." She rushed over, tossing some absorbent cloths at Daniel. "Here, help me clean this up before it ruins the finish." Daniel stood frozen, looking at the mess he'd made. "Can't we just call someone to—" "No," Ruth cut him off firmly. "We clean up our own mistakes here. Get down and help me." From the doorway of his study, Harold Kingston watched the scene unfold, though neither Ruth nor Daniel noticed his presence. A slight smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he observed his son, heir to billions, on his hands and knees soaking up cleaning solution. "You're doing it wrong," Ruth said, demonstrating the proper technique. "Like this, squeeze it out completely, then use fresh rags. Otherwise, you're just pushing the solution around." Daniel muttered under his breath but found himself mimicking Ruth's movements. The work was tedious, and his back started aching almost immediately. "How do you do this all day?" "Years of practice," Ruth answered simply. "And a good pair of shoes." She noticed his expensive leather loafers and shook her head. "Those won't last a week in this job." Once they'd contained the spill, Ruth stood up and pointed to the proper way to measure the solution. "Watch carefully. This much cleaner to this much water. Too much wastes product and leaves residue. Too little won't clean properly." To his own surprise, Daniel found himself paying attention. There was something in Ruth's matter-of-fact instruction that made it hard to maintain his usual attitude of superiority. She wasn't trying to impress him or gain his approval. She simply knew her job and did it well. They worked side by side for the next hour, with Ruth occasionally correcting Daniel's technique. She showed him how to move the mop in figure-8 patterns, how to avoid leaving streaks, and how to work efficiently without tiring too quickly. Harold continued to observe periodically from various vantage points throughout the morning, his expression unreadable. He watched as his son gradually began to mimic Ruth's movements, becoming slightly more coordinated with each passing hour. By mid-morning, Daniel had managed to clean an entire section of hallway without any major disasters. His sleeves were rolled up, his designer shirt was spotted with water, and his perfectly styled hair had fallen across his forehead. But the floor actually looked clean. Ruth inspected his work, running her finger along the surface to check for residue. "Not bad," she said finally. "You're learning." Daniel straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. He looked at the gleaming floor, then at Ruth, who was already moving on to the next section. For the first time, he felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Perhaps respect, or maybe just the satisfaction of completing a task properly. "Ruth?" he called out, his voice awkward and uncertain. She turned, raising an eyebrow questioningly. "Thanks," he said quietly, gesturing to the floor, "for showing me how to do it right." Ruth's expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes softened slightly. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to her work, her hands moving in their familiar rhythm across the floor. In his study, Harold Kingston sat back in his leather chair, a thoughtful expression replacing his earlier amusement. He watched as his son picked up his mop again, this time without complaint, and began cleaning the next section of floor. The morning sun had climbed higher now, illuminating the freshly cleaned floors until they gleamed like mirrors. Ruth's quiet humming had resumed, and now it was accompanied by the sound of two mops moving in steady rhythm across the marble surface. The Saturday afternoon sun beat down on Ruth's modest front yard, warming the patched grass and aging flower beds. Daniel Kingston stood at the edge of the property, looking distinctly out of place in his expensive workout clothes and pristine sneakers. His father's words from that morning still rang in his ears. "If you're playing janitor, you might as well make yourself useful on weekends too." Ruth emerged from her small house carrying 2 sets of gardening tools. Her gray hair was tied back with a faded bandana, and she wore well-worn jeans and a comfortable cotton shirt. "Welcome to weekend yard duty, Mr. Kingston," she said, extending a pair of work gloves toward him. Daniel accepted them with obvious reluctance. "I don't know the first thing about yard work." "Then it's time you learned." Ruth gestured to the overgrown flower beds. "We'll start with something simple, pulling weeds." The screen door creaked, and 7-year-old Tommy bounded out onto the front porch. His face lit up at the sight of Daniel. "You came to help Grandma Ruth," he exclaimed, jumping down the steps 2 at a time. "Tommy, careful on those steps," Ruth called out, but she couldn't hide her smile at his enthusiasm. Daniel shifted uncomfortably as the boy approached. There was something about Tommy's eager face and trusting eyes that made him feel both drawn to the child and desperate to maintain his distance. "Can I help too?" Tommy asked, bouncing on his toes. Ruth handed him a small plastic trowel. "Of course, sweetheart. Just stay close where we can see you." They settled into work under the afternoon sunday. Ruth demonstrated proper weed-pulling technique, showing Daniel how to grip close to the roots and pull firmly but steadily. Tommy mimicked their movements with his toy trowel, more interested in playing in the dirt than actually removing weeds. "This is harder than it looks," Daniel admitted after 15 minutes, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. His designer workout shirt was already stained with dirt. "Most worthwhile things are," Ruth replied simply, efficiently clearing her section of the flower bed. Tommy worked his way closer to Daniel, fascinated by the stranger who'd been spending so much time with his grandmother. He watched Daniel struggle with a particularly stubborn dandelion, giggling when it finally came free and sent Daniel stumbling backward. "You're funny," Tommy said, scooting even closer. "I like having you here." Daniel gave him an awkward half-smile, unsure how to respond to such innocent affection. The boy's presence stirred something unexpected in him, a weird mix of comfort and guilt he couldn't quite explain. The afternoon wore on, and the pile of pulled weeds grew steadily larger. Ruth worked methodically, pausing occasionally to guide Daniel's technique or praise Tommy's enthusiastic, if misguided efforts. The air was filled with the smell of fresh dirt and cut grass from the neighbors' yards. Tommy had been watching Daniel intently for several minutes when he suddenly moved right next to him. Daniel could feel the boy's small shoulder brush against his arm as they both knelt in the dirt. Then, Tommy leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a secret. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Daniel's hands froze mid-pull, soil crumbling between his fingers. The words hit him like a physical blow, sending his mind spinning through a blur of memories from years ago. He remembered Angela, Ruth's daughter, from what seemed like another lifetime. A summer fling he'd written off as meaningless. His throat went dry. The metallic clang of Ruth's garden tools hitting the ground shattered the moment. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of shock and concern. The screen door slammed, and Angela burst out onto the porch. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Tommy!" she called out, her voice strained. "Come inside, right now." Tommy looked confused, sensing the sudden tension but not understanding it. "Did I say something wrong?" Daniel remained frozen in place, unable to look at anyone. His mind raced through calculations. Tommy's age, that summer with Angela, the timing. It was possible. It was terrifyingly possible. The crunch of tires on gravel cut through the heavy silence. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, Harold Kingston's car. The engine cut off, and the door opened with a soft thunk that seemed to echo in the still afternoon air. Harold stepped out, his expensive suit incongruous against the backdrop of Ruth's humble home. He took in the scene before him with shrewd eyes. Daniel kneeling in the dirt, Tommy standing close beside him, Ruth's dropped tools scattered on the ground, and Angela's stricken face on the porch. The tension in the air was palpable. Secrets long buried had broken through the surface like unwanted weeds, and no one seemed to know what to do next. Tommy looked from face to face, his innocent revelation having triggered an avalanche he couldn't understand. A warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of a neighbor's wind chimes. But in Ruth's front yard, no one moved. No one spoke. The afternoon sun continued to shine down on the half-weeded flower bed, on the scattered tools, on 5 people whose lives had just become intensely more complicated. Harold's presence seemed to amplify the weight of Tommy's words. He stood at the edge of the yard, his expression unreadable, as the implications of what he'd just walked into began to register. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions and long-buried truths. Tommy fidgeted beside Daniel, still not understanding why his simple statement had caused such a dramatic change. Angela remained frozen on the porch, one hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Ruth's eyes moved between her daughter and Daniel, her usually calm demeanor shaken by this unexpected revelation, and Daniel remained on his knees in the dirt, the forgotten weed still clutched in his hand, as his world shifted dramatically on its axis. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "Mommy says you're my daddy." 6 simple words that threatened to unravel everything. The kitchen in Ruth's modest home felt impossibly small, with 4 adults crammed around the worn wooden table. Tommy had been gently sent to play in his room, though his revelation still hung heavy in the air. Afternoon sunlight filtered through threadbare curtains, casting long shadows across troubled faces. Harold Kingston's fingers drummed against the scratched tabletop, his expensive suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. "I demand an explanation," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "What exactly is this absurd claim about my son?" Angela Dawson sat directly across from him, her shoulders tense but her chin held high. Her waitress uniform from the diner where she worked was still on, the name tag slightly crooked. She looked between Daniel and Harold, then took a deep breath. "It was 7 years ago," she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "At the River Road bar. I was tending bar while putting myself through nursing school." She glanced at Daniel, who stared back with no hint of recognition. "You came in with your college friends, throwing money around like it meant nothing." Daniel's face had gone pale. I don't remember." "Of course you don't," Angela said bitterly. "I was just another girl to you. You didn't even ask my name properly. But I knew exactly who you were. Everyone knew the Kingston heir." Ruth's hands gripped her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. The maternal instinct to protect her daughter warred with her Christian teachings about forgiveness. "Angela," she said softly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I was ashamed, Mama," Angela's voice cracked. And by the time I realized I was pregnant, he'd disappeared off to Europe for months. The papers were full of stories about his partying. She looked directly at Daniel. I tried to contact you through your father's office. 3 times. Each time I was told Mr. Kingston didn't take calls from people like me. Harold's face darkened. My office receives dozens of such claims every month. Gold diggers and opportunists. I never asked for money, Angela shot back, tears welling in her eyes. I just thought he had a right to know. But after the 3rd rejection, I decided Tommy and I would be better off without any of you in our lives. Ruth finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years of watching her daughter struggle alone. All this time, I thought you were protecting Tommy's father, someone who couldn't help his situation. Never did I imagine. She turned to Daniel, disappointment etched across her face. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, distress evident in every movement. This can't be happening. I mean, how can you even be sure? Look at your son's eyes, Daniel, Angela said quietly. They're the same shade of green as yours. He has your chin, your laugh. Harold stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. This is preposterous. This is clearly some elaborate scheme. First, you manipulate your way into our lives with this ridiculous cleaning arrangement? And now this? Ruth rose to her full height, though she barely reached Harold's shoulder. Mr. Kingston, I have cleaned your floors for 5 years without complaint. I have endured your condescension with dignity, but I will not sit here and listen to you accuse my daughter of lying. The timing is rather convenient, isn't it? Harold sneered. Just as Daniel begins this little experiment in manual labor, suddenly there's a long-lost heir? Angela pushed back her chair and stood. I never wanted your money. I still don't. Tommy asked about his father because he saw Daniel here today. That's all. He's just a little boy who wants to know where he came from. Daniel had remained silent, his face a mask of confusion and growing panic. Suddenly he pushed away from the table. I need air. I can't. I need to think. He stumbled toward the door. Ruth followed him, leaving Harold and Angela locked in a tense standoff. She caught up with Daniel on the front porch, where he was pacing like a caged animal. Mr. Kingston, she said firmly, causing him to stop in his tracks. The setting sun cast long shadows across the worn boards of her porch, and in the distance they could hear Tommy's muffled laughter as he played with his toys. Daniel turned to her, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. What am I supposed to do? How can I possibly— If you are his father, Ruth said, her voice gentle but firm, prove it with your actions, not your money. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the treetops when Daniel's sports car pulled into the Kingston Estate's circular driveway. His designer clothes were wrinkled, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and 2 days of stubble darkened his jaw. He hadn't slept much since Tommy's innocent whisper had turned his world upside down. Ruth was already there, organizing cleaning supplies in the utility closet. She glanced up as Daniel approached, noting his disheveled appearance without comment. Good morning, she said simply, handing him a fresh microfiber cloth and a bottle of floor wax. I didn't think you'd still want me here, Daniel muttered, accepting the supplies with trembling hands. The floors don't clean themselves just because life gets complicated. Ruth's voice was firm but not unkind. She demonstrated the proper technique for applying the wax, moving in slow, deliberate circles. You need to work it in evenly. Too much in one spot will leave streaks. Daniel mimicked her movements, finding an odd comfort in the repetitive motion. The physical work helped quiet the chaos in his mind. I keep thinking about what Tommy said, he admitted after several minutes of silence. About Angela. I don't remember. That's part of the problem, isn't it? Ruth straightened up, her knees cracking slightly. You lived so carelessly that you don't even remember the people you hurt. Daniel's cheeks flushed with shame. I was different then, younger. Being young isn't an excuse for being cruel. Ruth dipped her cloth in the wax again. My James was young when he went to Vietnam, just 23, but he never forgot his responsibility to others. Daniel paused his work, watching Ruth's face soften at the mention of her husband. I didn't know you were married. 32 years ago, Ruth said quietly. James was a mechanic before he enlisted. We had such plans." She smiled sadly. "But God had other ideas. Angela was only 4 when we got the news." The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the half-waxed floor. Daniel found himself hanging on every word as Ruth continued. "I had no college degree, no savings to speak of. Took 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Cleaning houses during the day, waiting tables at night, doing laundry for neighbors on weekends." Ruth's hands never stopped moving as she spoke. "But we made it through." Angela grew up knowing the value of hard work and honest living. "Is that why you took this job?" Daniel asked, gesturing at the grand hallway around them. Ruth shook her head. "I took this job because honest work is honest work, no matter where you do it. Your father may pay my salary, but my real employer is the Lord above. Everything I do as if working for him." Daniel absorbed this, thinking about his own life of privilege. He'd never had to work for anything. Everything had been handed to him on a silver platter. Yet here was Ruth, who'd faced real hardship, carrying herself with more dignity than anyone he knew. "How did you do it?" he asked suddenly. "Raise Angela alone, I mean. Weren't you angry? Scared?" "Of course I was scared," Ruth admitted, moving to a new section of floor. "Terrified some nights. But being afraid doesn't pay the bills or put food on the table. You just have to keep going, one day at a time, trusting that God has a plan." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the fresh scent of wax filling the air. Daniel found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before, the way the morning light changed the color of the marble. How satisfying it was to see the dull floor transform into a gleaming surface under his hands. "Real worth," Ruth said suddenly, "comes from what you're willing to give, not what you're able to take. It comes from the sweat on your brow and the calluses on your hands." She held up her own work, worn hands as evidence. "Money can't buy character, Daniel. That has to be earned." The words hit Daniel hard, making him think of all the times he'd looked down on people like Ruth, people who worked with their hands, who lived paycheck to paycheck. He'd never considered their stories, their struggles, their dignity. As they finished the last section of floor, Ruth checked her watch. "Time for me to head to the community center," she said, gathering her supplies. "Community center?" Daniel hadn't known about this. "I volunteer there 3 days a week," Ruth explained, washing her hands at the utility sink. "Help serve lunch to the seniors, organize activities. Sometimes just sit and listen to their stories." She dried her hands on a paper towel. Everyone needs someone to listen to them. Daniel watched as she collected her worn purse and cardigan. She moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. It was so different from his own aimless existence. "Same time tomorrow," Ruth called over her shoulder as she headed for the door. "And bring a proper pair of work shoes. Those Italian loafers won't last a week doing this job." Daniel stood in the empty hallway, looking at his reflection in the freshly waxed floor. Ruth's words echoed in his mind. "Real worth comes from what you're willing to give." He glanced toward the door where she had disappeared, wondering about this other life she led. Serving others, even after a full morning of physical labor. The gleaming floor beneath his feet was a testament to honest work, something he'd never truly understood before. His hands were sore from the unaccustomed labor, but for the first time in his life the discomfort felt like something earned rather than something to complain about. Daniel's BMW crawled behind Ruth's ancient Buick, following her to the Pine Grove Senior Community Center. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his jaw clenched. The last thing he wanted was to spend more time doing charity work after a full day of cleaning, but Ruth had insisted. The community center was a weathered brick building with faded blue shutters. A crooked sign hung above the entrance, its paint peeling at the edges. Daniel parked next to Ruth's car, wincing at the sight of rust spots on her vehicle's doors. "I know this isn't what you planned for your evening," Ruth said as she climbed out of her car, carrying 2 large paper bags of groceries. "But sometimes the best things in life aren't planned at all." Daniel grabbed one of the bags from her without thinking. "I just don't see the point," he muttered. Inside, the center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The linoleum floor was scuffed but clean, and the walls were decorated with hand-drawn pictures and craft projects. The smell of coffee and something sweet, maybe cookies, drifted from the kitchen. Elderly residents sat in clusters around circular tables, some playing cards, others working on puzzles. A few looked up as Ruth entered, their faces brightening. "Ruth's here," called out a thin woman with silver hair. Several others echoed the greeting. "Evening, everyone," Ruth answered warmly. She headed straight for the kitchen, Daniel trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. In the kitchen, Ruth tied on an apron and started unpacking the groceries. "We serve dinner 3 nights a week," she explained, pulling out cans of soup and boxes of pasta. "Many of our seniors live alone. This gives them a chance to share a meal with friends." Daniel stood awkwardly by the counter, watching as Ruth moved with practiced efficiency. She seemed different here, more animated, more at home. The quiet dignity she showed at work transformed into something warmer, more maternal. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap wheeled himself into the kitchen. "Ruth, my angel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Martha's having a hard day. She keeps asking about George." Ruth's face softened with understanding. "I'll go sit with her, James. Daniel, would you mind stirring the soup while I'm gone?" Before Daniel could protest, she was already moving toward the dining area. He watched through the serving window as she sat beside a frail woman with trembling hands. Ruth took those hands in her own, speaking softly. "George was Martha's husband," James explained, noticing Daniel's confused expression. "Passed last year. Some days she forgets." Daniel stirred the soup mechanically, watching Ruth comfort Martha. The old woman's shoulders shook with silent sobs, but Ruth just held her hands and listened. After a few minutes, Martha was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, managing a weak smile. When dinner was ready, Daniel found himself roped into serving. He ladled soup into bowls, while Ruth handed out thick slices of fresh bread. The seniors filed past, each greeting Ruth by name. Many asked about Tommy, or offered concerned questions about Angela's job search. "Who's the handsome young man?" a spry woman in her 80s asked, winking at Daniel. "This is Daniel Kingston," Ruth answered. "He's learning about service." "Kingston?" Several heads turned. "Harold Kingston's boy?" Daniel braced himself for the usual reaction, the immediate shift to flattery and fawning that usually followed recognition of his family name. Instead, an old man at a nearby table just shrugged. "Well, good for you, young man. Everyone's got to start somewhere." After the meal, Ruth handed Daniel a broom. "The floor needs sweeping," she said. "I'll wash the dishes." As he swept, Daniel found himself drawn into conversations. A retired teacher asked about his education. A former mechanic told stories about fixing cars in the 1950s. A grandmother proudly showed photos of her great-grandchildren. They weren't impressed by his family's wealth, or his expensive watch. They just seemed grateful for his help and willing to share their stories. It was oddly refreshing. "Young man," called James, the veteran, "could you help me reach that magazine on the top shelf?" Daniel set aside the broom and walked over. As he handed James the magazine, the older man grabbed his wrist. "Ruth's a special lady," he said quietly. "Lost her Harry in Nam, same time I lost my legs. Never complained, never bitter, just kept going, helping others. That's real strength, son." Daniel glanced toward the kitchen where Ruth was drying dishes, humming an old hymn. He thought about her scrubbing floors every day, then coming here to serve others. He thought about Tommy's innocent face and Angela's worried eyes. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Later, as they walked to their cars in the purple dusk, Ruth touched his arm lightly. "You did well tonight, Daniel," she said softly. "I saw how gentle you were with Martha, how patient with Mr. Chen's long stories." Daniel ducked his head, unexpectedly pleased by her praise. A small smile tugged at his lips, and warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd earned someone's approval instead of buying it. "Thank you," he said simply. And meant it. Ruth nodded, understanding in her eyes. She didn't need to say more. The evening's lesson had been about more than sweeping floors or serving soup. It had been about seeing the worth in others, and maybe, just maybe, finding some worth in himself. The crunch of gravel under Daniel's tires seemed louder than usual as he pulled up to Ruth's modest home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the small front yard, where a rusty swing set creaked in the evening breeze. His Ferrari looked absurdly out of place next to Angela's scratched minivan. Daniel checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing back his dark hair. He'd traded his usual designer suit for a plain blue sweater and jeans still expensive, but less flashy. The bottle of wine he'd brought suddenly felt pretentious. Ruth had specifically told him to bring nothing but himself. Before he could knock, Tommy flung open the screen door. "You came!" The boy's face lit up with pure joy, making Daniel's chest tighten unexpectedly. "I promised, didn't I?" Daniel managed to smile, trying to ignore how natural it felt when Tommy grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. The house was small but warm, filled with the rich aroma of tomato sauce and garlic bread. Family photos lined the walls. Ruth younger and smiling, Angela as a child, Tommy's school pictures. No elaborate artwork or expensive decorations like at the Kingston estate, just memories preserved in simple frames. Angela stood at the stove stirring a pot of sauce. She gave Daniel a curt nod, her posture stiff. "Dinner's almost ready. Look what I drew today." Tommy tugged Daniel toward the refrigerator, where a crayon drawing was held up by a magnet shaped like a rainbow. "That's me, and that's you, and we're playing chess." The stick figures were crude but unmistakable, one tall with brown hair, one small with a big smile. "Very creative, Tommy," Daniel said, surprised by the warmth in his voice. He noticed other drawings nearby Ruth at her cleaning cart. Angela driving her van, all rendered in bright colors and wobbly lines. Ruth emerged from the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Tommy, help your mother set the table, please." The dining room table was small and scarred with water rings, nothing like the massive mahogany piece where Daniel had eaten countless silent meals with his father. Tommy carefully placed mismatched plates while Angela arranged forks and napkins. "It's just spaghetti," Angela said flatly, bringing over a steaming bowl. "Nothing fancy." "It smells wonderful," Daniel replied, meaning it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a home-cooked meal that wasn't prepared by hired help. They settled around the table, elbows occasionally bumping in the tight space. Ruth said grace, her words simple but heartfelt. Daniel found himself watching Tommy bow his head, small hands clasped seriously in prayer. "Can I sit next to Daniel?" Tommy asked, already scrambling into the chair beside him. "If that's all right with him," Ruth answered, passing the garlic bread. Daniel nodded, oddly touched by the request. He helped Tommy twirl spaghetti onto his fork, showing him how to use a spoon to catch the loose strands. The boy's concentration was intense, his tongue sticking out slightly as he worked to master the technique. "I got an A on my math test," Tommy announced proudly between bites, "and Mrs. Johnson said my story about the superhero janitor was very creative." Daniel caught Ruth hiding a smile behind her napkin. Even Angela's expression softened slightly. "A superhero janitor?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Tommy launched into an elaborate tale about a secret agent who cleaned by day and fought crime by night, complete with sound effects and dramatic hand gestures. His sauce-covered fork waved dangerously through the air until Angela gently lowered his arm. The conversation flowed naturally, nothing like the stilted small talk at society dinners. Tommy chatted about school and his friends. Ruth mentioned funny moments from the community center. Even Angela relaxed enough to share a story about a customer at her job at the bank. After dinner, Tommy spread his drawings across the coffee table, explaining each one in detail. There were spaceships, dinosaurs, and more family scenes moments captured through a child's eyes with love and imagination. "This one's my favorite," Tommy said, holding up a picture of what looked like a group of people at a park. "It's all of us having a picnic, see? Even Grandpa Harold is there." An uncomfortable silence fell. Daniel studied the drawing, noting how his father was depicted with a big smile, something he'd rarely seen in real life. "It's getting late, Tommy," Angela said quietly. "Time to get ready for bed." "Aw, Mom, can't Daniel read me a story first?" Angela hesitated, conflict clear on her face. But before she could answer, Tommy had already run to his room and returned with a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. "Just one story," Ruth intervened, catching Angela's eye. "Then straight to bed." Daniel sat awkwardly on the edge of Tommy's small bed, the boy snuggled close to his side. The room was cluttered with toys and more artwork, a nightlight casting star-shaped patterns on the ceiling. As he read, Daniel found himself doing different voices for the characters, encouraged by Tommy's delighted giggles. Later, driving back to his penthouse in the quiet city night, Daniel couldn't shake the warmth of that simple evening. His apartment felt cavernous and cold when he stepped inside, the designer furniture suddenly seeming more like a showroom than a home. He poured himself a drink and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering cityscape. Music from another rooftop party drifted up the kind of gathering he used to live for, full of beautiful people and empty conversations. In his bedroom, Daniel lay awake, Tommy's laughter echoing in his mind. He thought about the way the boy's eyes lit up when he arrived, the proud way he'd shown off his drawings, the trust in his voice as he asked for a bedtime story. Something ached in his chest, a hollow space he'd never noticed before tonight. The silk sheets felt too smooth, the imported mattress too soft. He remembered Tommy's small bedroom, filled with love and creativity, and his own childhood room, perfect and pristine and lonely. Sleep eluded him as he stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything he'd never known he was missing. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Ruth stood in the entrance, her hands smoothing the fabric of her simple navy dress, the nicest one she owned, purchased years ago for Angela's high school graduation. Around her, women draped in designer gowns and dripping with jewelry filled the space with tinkling laughter and the soft swish of silk. Daniel adjusted his bow tie, staying close to Ruth's side. He'd offered to buy her a new dress for the occasion, but she'd refused with her usual quiet dignity. "What I have is good enough," she'd said. Now, watching the sideways glances and raised eyebrows from the other guests, he wished she'd accepted. Harold Kingston worked the room like the master of ceremonies he was, shaking hands and laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. When he spotted Ruth and Daniel, he waved them over with forced enthusiasm. "Ah, there's my son," Harold boomed, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "And Ruth." He said her name, like it was something stuck in his throat. A cluster of society women turned to stare. One of them, Mrs. Worthington, peered at Ruth through her lorgnette, as if examining a curious specimen. "And what is it you do, dear?" she asked, though everyone knew exactly who Ruth was. "I'm a janitor at the Kingston estate," Ruth answered clearly, her head held high. Mrs. Worthington's perfectly painted lips curved into a smirk. "How quaint! And now you're playing nanny to Daniel as well, I hear. Teaching him the ways of the common folk?" Several people tittered behind their champagne glasses. Daniel felt his face grow hot with anger, but before he could speak, another woman chimed in. "I suppose someone has to teach him responsibility," she said with a cruel laugh. "Though I never thought Harold would stoop to hiring the help for that job." Ruth stood perfectly still, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. She'd faced worse in her life than these pampered socialites, but Daniel could see the hurt in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. Something snapped inside Daniel. The shame these people wanted him to feel transformed into fierce pride. He stepped forward, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cluster of onlookers. "You're right," he said clearly. "Someone does have to teach me responsibility, and I'm fortunate that person is Ruth Dawson." He looked directly at Mrs. Worthington. "She's the strongest person I know, and I'd be proud to be half the person she island." The silence spread through the ballroom like ripples in a pond. Harold, for once, seemed at a loss for words. Ruth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "While you've all been judging her clothes and her job," Daniel continued, his voice steady, "Ruth has been teaching me what real dignity looks like. She shows up every day at dawn, works harder than anyone I've ever met, and still finds time to volunteer helping others." He turned to face the whole room now. "She doesn't need designer dresses or fancy jewelry to have class. She has something better: integrity. And yes, she is teaching me, and I'm learning more from her than I ever did in business school." Mrs. Worthington's face had turned an interesting shade of pink. Several people suddenly found their shoes fascinating. In the corner, Harold Kingston watched his son with an expression that, for the first time in years, looked remarkably like pride. Ruth touched Daniel's arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "but you don't need to defend me." "Yes, I do," he replied, loud enough for others to hear. "Because you've defended me from my own worst self every day since we met." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of uncomfortable small talk and pointed avoidance from the society crowd. Daniel didn't care. He stayed by Ruth's side, matching her quiet dignity with his own newfound strength. As they drove home later that night in Daniel's car, the city lights painting streaks of gold across the windshield, Ruth broke their comfortable silence. "What you did back there," she said softly, "that took courage." Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel relaxed slightly. "I just told the truth, something you've been teaching me about." "Still," Ruth continued, "standing up to people you've known all your life, people like your father's friends, that's not easy." Daniel glanced at her then, and in that moment he saw her differently. Not as the janitor his father had mockingly suggested he marry, not as Tommy's grandmother, not even as his teacher in humility. He saw her as someone whose pride in him mattered more than all the approval of his father's wealthy friends combined. "You know what's funny?" he said, turning back to the road. "A few months ago I would have been right there with them, laughing at someone like you. Now I can't imagine being that person anymore." Ruth nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the same way she'd held them in the face of those cruel comments earlier. But now, there was a subtle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Sometimes," she said, "God puts people in our lives to hold up a mirror, not to show us who we are, but to show us who we could be." The streetlights cast alternating patterns of light and shadow across their faces as they drove through the quiet streets. In the distance, the Kingston Estates gates waited, but for the first time, Daniel wasn't in a hurry to get there. In Ruth's presence, he felt something he'd been searching for his whole life, the simple peace of knowing he'd done the right thing, and the quiet joy of making someone proud who truly deserved to be. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Harold Kingston's study. Ruth sat stiffly in one of the leather armchairs, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Angela perched nervously beside her, while Tommy played with his toy car on the Persian rug, making quiet, vrooming sounds. Daniel paced near the fireplace, his designer shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. The past few weeks had changed him. His shoulders carried less arrogance, his eyes held more warmth. But now, anxiety radiated from his rigid posture. Harold stood behind his massive mahogany desk, holding a crisp white envelope. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the room with calculated coldness. "I thought it best we handle this situation properly," he said, his voice clipped. "The results arrived this morning." Ruth reached for Angela's hand, squeezing it gently. She could feel her daughter trembling. "Open it," Daniel demanded, stopping his pacing. "Just get it over with." Harold carefully broke the seal and pulled out the papers. The room fell silent, except for Tommy's innocent play sounds. The boy remained blissfully unaware of the tension crackling through the air. As Harold's eyes scanned the document, a small, cruel smile tugged at his lips. "As I suspected," he announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "The DNA test shows conclusively that Daniel is not the father." The words hit like physical blows. Angela let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her free hand. Ruth felt her daughter's fingers go limp in her grasp. But that's not possible," Angela whispered. "There wasn't anyone else. I was so sure." Tommy looked up from his car, his young face scrunching in confusion. "What's DNA?" he asked innocently. The room grew even quieter. Daniel's face had drained of all color as he stared at the little boy, the child he'd begun to think of as his son. The chess lessons, the bedtime stories, the proud drawings now decorating his office desk, it all felt hollow suddenly. "It means," Harold said coldly, "that all your mother's accusations were false. Just as I warned Daniel, people like you always want something from us." "Harold!" Ruth stood up, her voice sharp with dignity. "That child is present. But Tommy was already beginning to understand. His lower lip trembled as he looked between the adults. "Island, is Mr. Daniel not going to be my daddy anymore?" Daniel made a sound, like he'd been punched in the gut. He turned to face the wall, his shoulders heaving. "Oh, baby," Angela sobbed, reaching for Tommy. But the boy scrambled away from her, his toy car forgotten on the floor. "You said he was my daddy." Tommy's voice rose with hurt and confusion. "You promised." Ruth tried to move toward her grandson, but Harold's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Well, well. It seems the truth finally comes out. All this time using an innocent child to manipulate my son? That's enough." Daniel whirled around, his face contorted with anger and pain. "They didn't manipulate anyone. Angela truly believed, we all believed. Because it was convenient to believe," Harold sneered. "A ready-made family for the reformed playboy. The perfect redemption story. But I knew better. Trash and lies, just as I said from the start." Tommy burst into tears, the sound echoing off the study's walls. Ruth finally reached him, gathering him into her arms. He buried his face in her shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs. Angela stood on unsteady legs. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she whispered. "I really thought. I was so certain." Daniel's fist suddenly slammed against the wall with a crack that made everyone jump. A picture frame crashed to the floor, glass shattering. The sound perfectly matched the breaking of the fragile bond that had been growing between them all. "Daniel," Ruth said softly, still holding Tommy. But Daniel couldn't look at any of them. His knuckles were bleeding where they'd struck the wall, but he didn't seem to notice. "All of it," he said hoarsely. "Everything I've learned, everything I've changed, it was all based on a lie." "No," Ruth started to say, but Harold cut her off. "Finally, you see reason," the older man said. "Now we can put this ridiculous charade behind us. The janitor experiment is over. You'll return to your proper place." Tommy's sobs grew louder, muffled against Ruth's shoulder. She could feel his tears soaking through her blouse. Angela stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, as she watched her son cling to his grandmother instead of her. Daniel's shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had stood up proudly at the charity gala, who had begun to find purpose in honest work and simple kindness, seemed to crumble before their eyes. Without another word, he walked to the study door and yanked it open. "Daniel, please," Angela called out, her voice breaking. But he was already gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Ruth held Tommy tighter, rocking him gently as Harold gathered the DNA papers with satisfied finality. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but its warmth had vanished, leaving only cold shadows in the elegant study where their dreams lay shattered. The screen door creaked as Ruth stepped onto her worn front porch, settling heavily into the old rocking chair. The evening air hung thick with humidity, matching the weight in her heart. Her usual straight-backed posture had given way to slumped shoulders, the day's events pressing down on her like a physical burden. The porch light flickered weakly, drawing moths that danced in erratic circles. Ruth watched them absently, her mind replaying Harold Kingston's triumphant sneer as he'd waved those test results. The memory made her stomach clench. She'd spent a lifetime building her dignity through honest work, teaching her children that character mattered more than circumstances. Now it felt like that carefully constructed foundation was crumbling. "Mama?" Angela's voice came softly from the doorway. "I brought you some tea." Ruth accepted the steaming mug without looking up. "Thank you, baby." Angela settled onto the porch steps, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I heard you on the phone earlier. You're not really thinking of quitting the estate job, are you?" "I don't know what else to do," Ruth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've brought shame on ourselves, getting mixed up with those people. I should have known better." "No, Mama." Angela turned to face her mother, her expression fierce. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. You're the one who taught me to hold my head high no matter what." Ruth sipped her tea, letting the warmth seep into her cold hands. "This is different. The whole situation. It's become such a mess. And poor Tommy." Her voice cracked slightly. "Tommy will be okay," Angela insisted, though her own eyes glistened. "He's strong, Like you. Like us. The distant sound of crickets filled the silence between them. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the modest houses along their street. Ruth thought of Mrs. Martinez next door, who relied on her for rides to doctor's appointments, of Mr. Johnson at the community center, whose face lit up every time she brought him fresh soup. "The senior center needs you," Angela continued, as if reading her thoughts. "Mrs. Chen can barely walk without her walker. Who's going to help her with her exercises, if you're not there? And what about old Mr. Peterson? You're the only one who can get him to take his medication." Ruth closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten. "I know, baby. But after today, nothing has changed about who you are," Angela interrupted firmly. "You're still Ruth Dawson, the woman who raised 2 kids alone after Daddy died. The woman who worked 3 jobs to put me through college. The woman who shows up every single day to help others, no matter how tired she island." Ruth's hands trembled slightly around her mug. "I just feel so foolish, getting involved in the Kingston's drama, thinking we could somehow, I don't even know what I was thinking." "You were thinking about helping someone," Angela said softly. "Like you always do, even when they don't deserve it." A moth landed on Ruth's knee, its wings moving slowly. She watched it, remembering how she'd caught Daniel watching her help Mrs. Chen with her walking exercises last week. There had been something in his eyes then, something real, beyond all his practiced arrogance. "The community needs you, Mama," Angela pressed gently. "Those fancy people at the estate, they don't matter. But Mrs. Martinez matters, Mr. Johnson matters. All those seniors who light up when you walk into the room, they matter." Ruth set her empty mug on the small table beside her chair. The night had grown darker, but the stars were beginning to peek through the clouds. She remembered praying under these same stars when Angela was sick as a baby, when the bills seemed impossible to pay, when her husband's death left her wondering how to go on. "I've been so worried about the shame," she admitted quietly. "But maybe that's pride talking. The Lord didn't put me here to worry about what rich folks think of me." Angela reached up and squeezed her mother's hand. "That's right. He put you here to do what you've always done, help people and show them what real strength looks like." Ruth squeezed back, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. The night air felt cooler now, cleaner somehow. She could hear Tommy's soft snores drifting through his open bedroom window above them. "I need to pray on it," Ruth said finally, her voice steadier. She looked out at the quiet street where she'd raised her children, taught them to walk, watched them grow. The same street where neighbors had brought casseroles when her husband died, where Mrs. Martinez had taught her to make tamales, where Mr. Johnson shoveled her walkway every winter despite his arthritis. The weight in her chest hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. She folded her hands in her lap, bowing her head slightly. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength." Angela squeezed her hand once more and stood quietly, understanding her mother needed this moment alone. The screen door whispered shut behind her, leaving Ruth with the night sounds, the stars, and her prayers. Daniel slumped into his Italian leather armchair, the crystal tumbler of scotch trembling in his hand. The penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city lights below, but tonight they only reminded him of how far removed he was from the real world, from Ruth's world. He took another long sip, welcoming the familiar burn. The massive TV screen stayed dark, reflecting his disheveled appearance. His designer suit jacket lay crumpled on the marble floor where he'd thrown it hours ago. "Trash and lies," his father's words echoed in his head. "Just as I said," Daniel hurled the glass across the room. It shattered against the wall, leaving an amber stain on the pristine white paint. The sound reminded him of Tommy's heartbreaking when the DNA results were read. Tommy. The thought of the little boy's face made Daniel's chest ache. He'd started to imagine weekend fishing trips, teaching him to ride a bike, being the father he'd never had himself. But it had all been built on a lie. "You're nothing but a disappointment," Harold's voice sneered in his memory. Daniel stumbled to the bar for another drink, catching his reflection in the mirrored backsplash. His tie hung loose, his eyes were bloodshot, and his usually perfectly styled hair was a mess from running his fingers through it repeatedly. He thought of Ruth's face when she'd first handed him that mop, expecting nothing but willing to give him a chance. Her quiet dignity, as she'd taught him to clean floors properly, never complaining about his attitude. The way she hummed hymns while she worked, finding joy in the simplest tasks. Real worth comes from sweat, not wealth, she'd told him. At the time, he'd thought it was just another one of her sermons. Now, the words hit differently. The memory of the community center surfaced, watching Ruth serve soup to veterans, the genuine smiles she received in return. He'd felt something that day, something he couldn't name. Pride? Purpose? The foreign feeling had scared him then. Daniel grabbed the bottle instead of a glass this time, but paused before drinking. In the mirror, his father's disapproving scowl seemed to stare back at him, but underneath that, he saw something else. The entitled, shallow man he'd become. The kind of man who'd sleep with a woman and not even remember her name. The kind who'd mock honest work while living off his father's money. "I don't want to be him anymore," Daniel whispered to his reflection. The admission hung in the air, surprising even himself with its raw honesty. He thought of the dinners at Ruth's modest home, the warmth, the laughter, Tommy's drawings proudly displayed on the fridge. His own massive penthouse suddenly felt cold and empty in comparison. All the expensive furniture and artwork couldn't fill the hollow space inside him. The bottle slipped from his fingers, rolling across the floor. Daniel's legs gave out, and he slid down against the bar, head in his hands. For the first time since he was a child, he felt truly lost. "What do I do?" he whispered to the empty room. Ruth would know, she always seemed to have answers. But Ruth found her answers in prayer, in that unshakable faith that had carried her through losing her husband, raising her children alone, years of back-breaking work. Daniel had never prayed before. The very idea felt foreign, uncomfortable. But right now, alone in his penthouse with his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, what did he have to lose? Awkwardly, he lowered himself to his knees. The expensive carpet cushioned them, but he felt exposed, vulnerable. His hands clasped together uncertainly. "God?" his voice cracked. I don't know how to do this." Ruth would probably do it better. He gave a shaky laugh. "I've made such a mess of everything. I thought being rich meant being better than everyone else. But Ruth, she has nothing, and she's worth 10 of me." Tears he hadn't expected burned his eyes. "I know I'm not Tommy's father, but when he smiled at me, when he showed me his drawings, I felt like maybe I could be somebody's father someday. Somebody worth looking up to." The words came easier now, spilling out in the darkness. "I don't want to be that man in the mirror anymore, the one who only cares about himself. I want to be the kind of man Ruth believed I could be, even if it's too late, even if I've ruined everything." His prayer trailed off into silence. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, unchanged, but something felt different inside him. Lighter, maybe, or just more clear. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, steadier now despite the alcohol in his system. He caught his reflection one more time, the designer clothes, the carefully maintained image of success. It all seemed hollow now. Tomorrow. He would go see Ruth tomorrow, try to make things right, not with money or grand gestures, but with truth. Even if she slammed the door in his face, he owed her that much. Daniel made his way to his bedroom, not bothering to pick up his scattered clothes or the broken glass. For the first time in years, appearances didn't matter. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, perhaps, a chance at redemption. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was Tommy's smile, bright and trusting, and Ruth's quiet strength as she faced each day with grace. He would try to be worthy of that trust, that belief in second chances. It was all he could do now. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ruth's modest front yard, where dandelions pushed through cracks in the concrete path. Daniel stood at the bottom of the worn wooden steps, his expensive shoes scuffed and his clothes wrinkled from a sleepless night. His hands trembled slightly as he climbed the steps one at a time. Before he could knock, the screen door creaked open. Ruth stood there in her faded house dress, her eyes tired but kind. Behind her, Angela hovered protectively, arms crossed. Little Tommy peeked around his mother's leg, his face uncertain. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry for everything." He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "May I come in, please?" Ruth studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come on in, Daniel." The living room was small but tidy, with well-worn furniture and family photos covering the walls. A box of Tommy's crayons and drawings lay scattered on the coffee table. Daniel's throat tightened at the sight. "I've been such a fool," he said, standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. "All my life, I measured everything by money and status. I looked down on people who worked hard, honest jobs. I treated life like some kind of game." Angela shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Tommy edged closer to his mother, clutching her hand. "But these past weeks," Daniel's voice cracked. "Working with you, Ruth. Seeing how you treat people. Learning what real strength looks like. It changed something in me." He turned to Angela. "And I am so deeply sorry for how I treated you years ago. I was selfish and thoughtless." Tears welled in Angela's eyes, but she blinked them back. "We've managed just fine without you," she said, though her voice wavered. "I know you have," Daniel replied. "You're both incredible mothers. You've given Tommy everything I never had. Love, stability, values." He took a deep breath and slowly knelt down until he was at eye level with Tommy. The boy's brown eyes, so full of hurt and hope, pierced straight to Daniel's heart. "Tommy," he said gently, "I know I'm not your father by blood. The test proved that." Tommy's lower lip trembled, but Daniel continued, "But being a real father isn't about DNA or biology. It's about choosing to love someone with your whole heart, about being there every single day, about teaching them and protecting them and helping them grow." He held out his hands, palms up. "If you'll let me, I want to choose to be your father. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because these past weeks have shown me what truly matters in life. And you, Tommy, matter more than all the money and fancy things in the world." Tommy's eyes grew wide. You still want to be my daddy?" "More than anything," Daniel whispered. "Will you let me try?" Tommy burst into tears and launched himself forward, wrapping his small arms around Daniel's neck. Daniel held him close, his own tears falling freely now. "I'm here, buddy," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Ruth pressed a hand to her heart, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Even Angela couldn't hold back her emotions, covering her mouth as she sobbed quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Daniel said, still holding Tommy. "But I'm asking for a chance to prove myself, not as some rich man's son, but as a person trying to be better, to be worthy of this family." Ruth stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Sometimes He uses our mistakes to lead us to where we need to be." Tommy pulled back slightly, his face tear-stained but beaming. "Can we play chess later? And maybe you can come to my school play next week?" Daniel laughed through his tears. "I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world." Outside, parked discreetly down the street in his black Mercedes, Harold Kingston gripped his steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Through his tinted windows, he had witnessed the entire scene unfold on Ruth's porch and through her front window. His son's words echoed in his mind, shaking loose something hard and cold that had resided there for decades. For the first time in years, Harold felt tears stinging his eyes as he watched his son hold Tommy, saw the genuine love and commitment in Daniel's face. It was an expression he had never seen before, one that all his billions had never managed to put there. The proud businessman sat there, humbled and shaken, as he realized that perhaps he had been wrong about what made a man truly rich. Daniel strode into his father's study, his footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floors. The room smelled of leather and old books, just as it always had, but something felt different today. Maybe it was him who had changed. Harold Kingston sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reading through documents with his usual stern expression. He barely looked up when Daniel entered, maintaining the cold distance he'd perfected over 3 decades of parenting. "I suppose you're here to quit this foolish arrangement," Harold said, his voice carrying that familiar note of disappointment. He shuffled his papers, treating his son's presence as a minor inconvenience. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. The lessons from cleaning floors with Ruth, from seeing genuine smiles at the community center, from Tommy's pure love, they all gave him strength now. "No, Dad. I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. About everything." That got Harold's attention. He set down his papers and leaned back in his leather chair, eyebrows raised. "Wrong about what exactly?" "About what makes a person worthy." Daniel moved closer to the desk, planting his hands firmly on its surface. "You've spent my whole life measuring everything in dollars and cents, but Ruth, she showed me there's so much more." Harold's face hardened. "That janitor has filled your head with nonsense. That janitor," Daniel cut in, his voice sharp, "has more wisdom in her calloused hands than you've found in all your boardrooms. She taught me that real worth isn't in a bank account. It's in how you treat people." "Oh, please," Harold scoffed, standing up. "Don't tell me a few weeks of playing poor has turned you into some kind of philosopher. You're a Kingston. Act like one." "That's exactly what I'm doing," Daniel said, straightening his spine. "I'm standing up for what I believe in. For the first time in my life, I understand what matters. Money without love is worthless. Power without compassion is empty." Harold circled around his desk, his expression thunderous. "You think love puts food on the table? You think compassion builds empires?" "No," Daniel replied calmly. "But I've seen Ruth feed more souls at that community center than your charity galas ever have. I've watched her turn mops and buckets into lessons about dignity. While you were building your empire, Dad, she was building something greater. Character." "Character doesn't pay bills," Harold snapped. "Maybe not," Daniel acknowledged, "but it gives life meaning. Every morning I watched Ruth come to work with a smile, even though her joints ached. She treated everyone, even you, with respect, even when they didn't deserve it. That's true wealth, Dad. The kind you can't buy." Harold's face reddened. "I built all this for you. Everything I did was to secure your future. And all it did was trap me in a golden cage," Daniel shot back. "I was nothing but a spoiled, entitled brat until Ruth showed me different. She taught me that real joy comes from serving others, not being served. That true respect is earned through actions, not bought with threats." "You're throwing away everything I built." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm but gentle now. "I'm building something new, something better. Ruth showed me that family isn't about DNA tests or trust funds, it's about choice. Just like I chose to be there for Tommy, even though he's not my blood. That's what makes a real father, Dad. Being present, showing love, teaching values." Harold fell silent, his hands gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away seconds that felt like hours. "You think you know so much now?" Harold's voice was quieter, less certain. "Because some cleaning woman showed you how to mop floors?" "She showed me how to be human," Daniel replied. "How to see worth in everyone, not just those who can benefit me. The janitors, the gardeners, the cooking staff, they're not beneath us, Dad. They're the ones holding this whole place together, just like Ruth holds her community together." Daniel watched something shift in his father's eyes. A crack in the armor of arrogance he'd worn for so long. "Every day," Daniel continued, "Ruth chooses joy over bitterness, kindness over cruelty. She lost her husband, struggled to raise her family, but never lost her dignity. That's true strength, Dad. Not the kind that comes from crushing competitors or building fortunes." Harold sank slowly into his chair, looking suddenly older, more vulnerable. "And you think this makes you stronger?" "I know it does," Daniel said firmly. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of failing you. I'm not chasing your approval anymore. Ruth taught me that real success isn't in the size of your bank account. It's in the size of your heart." The study fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Heavy with possibility rather than judgment. Harold stared at his son, as if seeing him for the first time. Finally, Harold's shoulders slumped slightly. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you're richer than I'll ever be." The late afternoon sun streamed through the community center's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Daniel Kingston stood at the front of the room, his sleeves rolled up and his designer watch replaced by a simple timepiece. The transformation wasn't just in his appearance. It showed in how he carried himself, in the gentle way he helped a young boy with his homework. "Mr. Kingston, can you check my math?" The boy held up his worksheet, pencil marks scattered across the page. "Sure thing, Marcus." Daniel pulled up a chair, his expensive suit pants now familiar with the center's well-used furniture. As he patiently explained the problem, Ruth watched from the doorway, her weathered hands clasped together. The community center buzzed with activity. Children sprawled on the floor with books, while others gathered around tables working on art projects. The walls, once bare, now displayed colorful drawings and achievement certificates. In one corner, Tommy sat cross-legged, teaching a younger child how to build with blocks. "I never thought I'd see the day," Angela whispered, coming to stand beside her mother. She'd softened toward Daniel over the past weeks, watching him show up day after day, never complaining about the long hours or modest surroundings. Ruth nodded, her eyes glistening. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Daniel finished helping Marcus and stood up, clearing his throat to address the room. Parents who had come to pick up their children paused, and the regular volunteers gathered closer. Even the youngest kids sensed something important was about to happen. "I've been thinking a lot about what this place means," Daniel began, his voice carrying the warmth that had replaced his former cynicism. "About what all of you have taught me." He glanced at Ruth, who gave him an encouraging smile. "That's why I want to announce something special today." Tommy abandoned his blocks and scampered over to sit at Daniel's feet, looking up at him with complete adoration. The sight made Angela's throat tighten. Their relationship had blossomed, despite the DNA results, proving that love truly transcended blood. "I'm starting a foundation," Daniel continued, "dedicated to supporting centers like this one across the city. Places where children can learn, grow, and dream big, no matter their circumstances." He reached down and ruffled Tommy's hair. "Where every child knows they matter." A murmur of excitement rippled through the room. One of the older volunteers, Miss Peterson, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She'd been running programs here for 20 years on a shoestring budget. "The Kingston Dawson Youth Foundation will provide educational resources, after-school programs, and mentorship opportunities." Daniel's voice grew stronger, passionate. "And I'm hoping that Angela will consider coming on board as our program director." Angela's eyes widened. She looked at her mother, who beamed with pride, then back at Daniel. "Are you serious?" "Nobody knows these kids, and their needs better than you do," Daniel said. "You've been here every step of the way, even when you didn't trust me." He smiled ruefully. "Especially then." The children began chattering excitedly, picking up on the adults' enthusiasm. Tommy bounced up and down, tugging on Angela's sleeve. "Mom, you're going to help other kids like me!" Angela knelt down beside her son, pulling him close. "Yes, baby. I think I am." She looked up at Daniel, her eyes soft. "Thank you." Ruth watched as Daniel moved through the room, shaking hands with parents and listening to the volunteers' ideas. He stopped to help a little girl clean up spilled markers, not caring that the ink stained his expensive shirt. The entitled young man who had first arrived at the estate with a sneer was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true meaning of wealth. "The foundation will need office space," Daniel was saying to Miss Peterson. "I was thinking we could renovate the old building next door, make it our headquarters, keep everything right here in the heart of the community." Tommy ran circles around the adults, declaring, "I'm going to help too. I can teach the little kids, just like Daniel teaches me." The afternoon light was fading now, casting orange shadows through the windows. Parents began gathering their children, but the excitement lingered in the air. Daniel had given them something precious, not just resources, but hope. Ruth made her way through the crowd toward Daniel. He was kneeling now, helping Tommy and another boy clean up the blocks. His tie was loose, his hair slightly mussed, and he looked more at peace than she'd ever seen him. "Ruth," he said, standing as she approached, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." His voice was thick with emotion. You saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself." Around them, Angela was already deep in conversation with Miss Peterson about program ideas. Tommy darted between the adults, still buzzing with excitement. The community center, which had always been filled with love, now hummed with new possibility. Ruth reached out and clasped Daniel's hand in hers. His fingers were calloused now from months of honest work, matching her own. "You've become the man I always believed you could be," she said softly, her eyes shining with maternal pride. The community center buzzed with celebration on a warm spring evening. Colorful balloons and streamers decorated the once plain walls, and the aroma of fresh-baked cookies filled the air. A hand-painted banner stretched across the entrance. 1-year anniversary, Kingston Youth Foundation. Ruth Dawson stood near the refreshment table, her silver hair neatly styled and wearing a simple blue dress that Angela had picked out for her. She watched the scene before her with quiet joy, her weathered hands clasped together as if in constant prayer. Daniel Kingston moved through the crowd with easy grace, stopping to chat with volunteers and pat children on the shoulder. Gone was the entitled smirk and designer suits. Instead, he wore khakis and a polo shirt, and his genuine smile reached his eyes. When a young boy tugged at his sleeve to show him a drawing, Daniel knelt down to the child's level, giving him his full attention. "Look at him now," Angela said softly, coming to stand beside her mother. "Who would have thought?" Ruth smiled. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Tommy, now 8 years old, darted between the guests with a plate of cookies he'd helped bake. His face lit up when he spotted Harold Kingston standing somewhat awkwardly near the door. "Grandpa Harold," Tommy called out, rushing over. "You have to try these. I made them myself." Harold's stern face softened as he accepted a cookie. The past year had carved new lines around his eyes, but they were laugh lines now, not frown lines. He wore a casual sweater instead of his usual business suit, though he still stood straight as an arrow. "Thank you, young man," Harold said, taking a careful bite. "Excellent work." Ruth remembered a time when Harold wouldn't have deigned to eat anything made in this humble kitchen. Now here he was, praising Tommy's baking skills with genuine warmth. Daniel approached their small group, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Dad, I'm glad you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," Harold replied. And the simple words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. The room grew quiet as Daniel stepped up to the microphone. "A year ago, I wouldn't have been caught dead in a place like this," he began, earning knowing chuckles from the crowd. "I was too busy chasing empty dreams and measuring my worth in dollar signs." Ruth watched him pause, gathering his thoughts. She remembered that angry young man who'd first shown up with his designer clothes and disdainful attitude, determined to fail at being a janitor. "But then God sent me an angel disguised as a janitor," Daniel continued, his eyes finding Ruth's. "She taught me that real wealth isn't in your bank account, it's in your heart. That true strength comes from serving others. That family isn't about blood, but about choice." Angela squeezed her mother's hand, and Ruth felt tears welling up in her eyes. "This foundation has helped over 200 kids this year," Daniel said proudly. "We've provided tutoring, meals, mentorship, and most importantly, hope. And none of it would have happened without Ruth Dawson's courage to see past my facade and believe in the person I could become." Harold stepped forward then, clearing his throat. "If I may," he said, taking the microphone. The room fell silent. Harold Kingston, speaking at a community center, was still something of a novelty. "When my son first told me he was starting this foundation, I thought he'd lost his mind." He paused, a hint of his old smirk playing at his lips. "Turns out, I was the one who needed my mind changed. Which is why I'm announcing tonight that Kingston Industries will match every donation to the foundation dollar for dollar, indefinitely." Gasps and applause filled the room. Daniel stared at his father in surprise, while Tommy bounced excitedly. "Does this mean we can help more kids?" Tommy asked, tugging on Daniel's sleeve. "That's exactly what it means, buddy," Daniel answered, ruffling Tommy's hair. Ruth watched as Harold awkwardly accepted a hug from his son, noting how the older man's eyes glistened suspiciously. A year ago, such a display of emotion would have been unthinkable. The celebration continued around them as volunteers served cake and children played games. Ruth found herself remembering that morning in the Kingston mansion when she'd made her bold counteroffer. She'd been terrified then, but something stronger than fear had made her speak up. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Angela asked, joining her mother again. "Just thinking about how far we've all come," Ruth replied. "Remember how worried you were about this whole arrangement?" Angela laughed softly. "Can you blame me? But you were right, Mama. You saw something in Daniel that none of us did." "I saw what the Lord wanted me to see," Ruth said simply. "A lost soul in need of direction." Across the room, Daniel was teaching a group of children how to play chess, the same patient way he'd taught Tommy. Harold stood nearby, occasionally offering strategy tips to the kids who were waiting their turn. The sound system began playing soft music, and couples started swaying on the makeshift dance floor. Ruth felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. "May I have this dance?" Daniel asked, extending his hand with a smile that held no trace of his former arrogance. Ruth took his hand, letting him lead her onto the floor. "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" she mused. "You did," he answered simply. "You saw it all along." As they swayed to the music, Ruth caught sight of Tommy teaching Harold some kind of complicated handshake, while Angela looked on with amused tolerance. The scene warmed her heart. This unlikely family, bound together not by blood or money, but by something far stronger. The music shifted to an old hymn, one Ruth recognized from her childhood church. Without thinking, she began to hum along. Daniel joined in, his voice carrying the harmony she'd taught him during their long days of cleaning together. Around them, the community center glowed with warmth and life. Children laughed, volunteers shared stories, and the smell of home-baked cookies lingered in the air. Ruth felt tears of gratitude spring to her eyes. "Come here, everyone," she called softly to her family. They gathered around her, Daniel, Angela, Tommy, and even Harold, joining hands in a circle. Ruth closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks. "Lord, you've blessed us beyond measure. You've turned strangers into family, pride into humility, and fear into love. Thank you for showing us that the strongest bonds aren't the ones we're born with, but the ones we choose to forge." "Amen," they answered in unison, and even Harold's voice was thick with emotion. They stood there together, hands clasped tight, as the music played on and laughter echoed through the hall. In that moment, Ruth knew with certainty that love, chosen, tested, and redeemed, had created something beautiful out of what once seemed impossible. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ruth Dawson, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.